You're looking so fresh because you've just gotten off, I think, about 6 airplanes from Asia. Yeah. We'll get into that trip in a minute. My name's Rana Faruhar. I'm the global business columnist and associate editor at the FT, and we've got about a half an hour here with the Secretary, and we're going to try and cover a lot of ground. Secretary, let me scene set. We've got a lot to talk about domestically, a lot of agenda shifts that the Biden administration is trying to do, that you're trying to do. There's also a lot happening globally. But to me, in some ways, the connective tissue is that we are at a pivot point. We really seem to be at a pivot point, both in the US, but globally, economically, politically, into what some people I have written in columns are calling the post-neoliberal world, a world in which, you know, for a long time we thought growth was all about, particularly in the US, all about tax cuts and deregulation and unleashing animal spirits. And then we got the financial crisis, and then we got a lot of monetary policy, and then we got a pandemic, and now we have a war, and we're really in a crisis, a kind of a crisis of the old order in some ways. And we're seeing that at a global level, a lot of conversations in Davos about deglobalization. But within the context of the US, there's also a really big policy shift going on, and I'm not sure actually that the international community understands how profound it is. When the president talks about prioritizing work, not wealth, investment, and not just supply-side economics, that's a big deal within the context of the US. And so I'm going to just open it up and ask you to kind of define for the US what that pivot means. And then we'll tease that out, and then I want to get into some of the global issues.
Yeah, okay, a lot to cover. Thank you for having me. First, I do want to take just a moment to begin to acknowledge the tragedy in Texas and ask every single person who's listening to us, every governor, every mayor, every member of Congress, to ask yourself today, what are you going to do about this? Because children are being gunned down in their communities, and we can't just brush by that. So I want to get to the topics you're talking about. You're a mother, I'm a mother, and this isn't okay, and it shouldn't be standard.
I want to just second that. You know, we had a shooting in Brooklyn, where I live, recently. My son was 2 trains behind the station. So 100%, I hope everybody is listening to this. Yeah, we have a problem in our country in this regard.
Beyond a problem, and we have the power to change it.
Yeah.
We policymakers, so let's get to the business of doing that.
I'm so glad you started with that. Okay.
Okay, so to your question, let's think about where to begin. I should say this. In my judgment, the economic theory that says all you have to do is cut taxes and deregulate, and that will lead to growth and prosperity, my own view is that is a clearly failed economic theory. Now, I have some experience with this because prior to this job, I was the governor of Rhode Island. And I was elected in 2014. At the time I ran in Rhode Island, we had the highest unemployment rate in the country. The unemployment rate in the building trades was 25%. This shouldn't be about politics. I was the first Democrat elected after 24 years of Republicans, and I only mention that because for 24 years, all Rhode Island did was cut taxes and deregulate, and it landed us at the bottom. And what I did, I kept taxes at a reasonable competitive level, which you have to do. You have to be competitive.
Right.
You can't disincentivize investment.
Right.
But it's also about investing.
Right.
Right? So on a state level, we brought about 2 years tuition-free community college, worker training, huge investments in broadband and infrastructure, and I saw it work.
Yeah.
When I left, we had the lowest unemployment rate in decades. We had a vibrant business community. And so that is that's one state, but the theory is the same, which is to say, and this is what we are doing now in the Biden administration, investments in broadband. 30 million Americans don't have internet in America. You're not going to have broadly shared prosperity, innovation, entrepreneurship. So we're making a $65 billion investment to bring about broadband, clean water, basic infrastructure, transportation, skills. Skills. We have to invest in skills. Half people who go to college in America don't graduate.
Right.
They drop out with debt and no degree. So what's the point? The point is, as I said, my view is cutting taxes and deregulating probably has worked for those at the top.
Yeah.
The level of divisiveness in our politics today is, in my judgment, directly related to the income inequality and people feeling angry that no matter how hard they work, they're not getting ahead.
Yeah.
So we have to, I'm not arguing for sky-high taxes or unproductive regulations. There's still work to do with permitting and such. But we have to get into the business of investing in our people, in education, in infrastructure, in supply chains, in manufacturing, if we want to have growth that's more broadly shared.
So, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. The economist Danny Roderick, famously has looked at these issues and thinking about trade, supply chains, how to create a robust domestic economy in the context of being part of a global economy that, trade is great, it grows the pie overall, but there are areas in particularly rich countries that have been hollowed out. For every dollar of trade efficiency, you're getting $50, according to him, of redistribution upward to the rich. So you and the president just came back from Asia thinking about a new trading paradigm at a time when, we really are at a pivot point. Call it what you will, one world, two systems, post-neoliberal world. Where are we going? What are you hearing from allies in Asia? What should the international community here take away?
Yeah, so I would say trade is good. Globalization is good. We need to remain open. However, we all have to play by the rules. There has to be a level playing field. Labor standards matter. Environmental standards matter. Certain countries, particularly China, their industrial policy puts our workers and our businesses at a massive disadvantage.
Yeah.
So trade can work and is necessary if we play by the rules.
Yeah.
It benefits American workers and American consumers, but we have to, like I said, have a level playing field and enforce the rules, which is a lot of what I do at the Commerce Department.
Well, and that's been something that's been difficult within the context of the global system recently.
Absolutely.
Where are we going on that front? And what were you hearing from some of the ASEAN nations in terms of, what kind of agreements could we be looking at? Is there some low-hanging fruit anywhere?
So I would say this, there's a huge appetite in the Indo-Pacific for America to show up and lead economically. I'm the lead on this Indo-Pacific economic framework, so I've been spending a lot of time in the region. It is very significant that the president could stand with 12 other world leaders and all 13 countries representing 40% of the world's GDP saying, we want to work together as economies around supply chains, semiconductors, decarbonization, infrastructure, digital trade, to make our economies work better together. I do think this is ambitious and inclusive. I think the fact that you have, all of ASEAN plus, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, India together saying we want to make our economies work better together is important. And what we are endeavoring to do under the president's leadership is move beyond a quote-unquote traditional trade agreement to tackle issues like supply chains, like how do we work together around securing critical minerals, raw materials, digital trade, technology standards. These are things, you don't typically talk about tech standards in a traditional trade agreement. But setting the rules of the road around how we're going to use artificial intelligence with like-minded countries is so important. Because I'll tell you, if we don't, China and Russia will set those rules of the road, and we will all suffer because of it.
Well, 100%. So on that score, there is a meeting, I think in a few weeks coming up, of the European-U.S. Tech and Trade Partnership. That's another area in which some of these digital rules of the road are being discussed. Where do you see any kind of common ground, common threads developing between a transatlantic partnership, bringing ASEAN countries, Japan, Australia in? What could that kind of coalition of the willing in digital trade look like?
So this is what makes me so optimistic. I think we bring it all together. We bring it all together, and America leads. So I'm the co-chair of that Trade and Technology US-EU Council, and we're talking about the exact same things. One of the things that I'm so pleased we were able to accomplish is, with the EU, is the Privacy Shield, which is enabling cross-border data flows. Now we need to do that with the Indo-Pacific. But if you imagine a world where the US and the EU allow cross-border data flows consistent with our values, protecting privacy, and also a similar structure as between the US and those dozen countries, that is so powerful. Powerful for US business, powerful for those countries, and it's all consistent with our values. Like I said, protecting privacy, protecting human rights, protecting the environment. So I think that this is it's a moment for America to step up and lead, which I think we are doing, and really to collaborate, not to dictate, but to collaborate. And that's the message, with the Indo-Pacific Partnership. What I have said to all the ASEAN leaders is partner with us to figure this out.
It's interesting, thinking about trade and values, relinking trade to values is, I think, a really powerful message, hearing that from a lot of parts of the administration. I want to go back to something you said about industrial policy and the fact that, and this has been the case for a couple of decades now, that the U.S. is increasingly competing against state-run economies that have, namely China, that have strong industrial policies. Actually, most countries, aside from the U.S., have official industrial policies of some kind. I think that there's a great case to be made, particularly post-COVID, post-war in Ukraine, for more resiliency in supply chains, more redundancy. You're working on semiconductors, building that redundancy. Europe is doing the same thing. There does seem to be a kind of a regionalization developing where you're going to have more supply chains in more places. That's good. It could also potentially be inflationary, at least in the short term.
Yes.
Talk about that balance, and what are you hearing from business, and how can we get over that hump? Can we get over that hump?
We can, we have to. And this is why I say, look, trade is good. We can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We have to learn the lessons of, trade can be harmful if countries don't follow the rules, but we can't make everything in America, right? That isn't going to happen. It shouldn't happen. But we need strong partnerships. So last Friday night, I was in Seoul with President Biden, and we were touring a Samsung manufacturing facility, semiconductor manufacturing facility. It's the largest, most sophisticated semiconductor manufacturing facility in the world. And I just stood there. It was really something to behold. And I said, America risks losing out on this if we don't move. So right now, before the United States Congress, is a bill called the CHIPS bill.
Yep.
It calls for a $52 billion investment that the Commerce Department would invest to stimulate, incentivize domestic production of semiconductors. We can't blow that.
Yeah.
Right? If we blow it, if Congress dilly-dallies and doesn't pass this in the next few months, then that facility that I was standing in, instead of being erected in, Texas, Kansas, New York, Arizona, someplace in America, it won't. It will not be. It will be in Asia. It will be somewhere else. So, look, China invests, this is stunning, China invests as a percent of their GDP more in their industrial planning than they do in their military. Hundreds of billions of dollars in incentivizing, now subsidizing to extreme, strategic industries, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, semiconductors, technology, emerging technology. America has to pick up its game, and we have to do that working with our allies.
Let's talk about that a little bit. I did an event recently in D.C. at the Atlantic Council with Janet Yellen, and she used the word friendshoring. And a lot of people, particularly in Europe, want to know what that means. I'm curious if you can maybe elaborate on that and also put it in the context of what's going on in Europe right now, energy crisis, war in Ukraine, the supply chain issues that were already happening with COVID now really being put on steroids. How do you see friendshoring? What might that look like?
So America, in the past 25 years, America has lost about 25% of its small and medium-sized manufacturers. And if you go to Ohio, Indiana, Rhode Island, frankly, we lived it. Deindustrialization really hurt. All these small tooling companies, machine, et cetera, chemical companies, all went out of business, all to Asia. Much of that, we have to figure out a way to get back in America. But as I said before, much of that will not come back to America.
Right.
So we have to recognize that. And I think friendshoring recognizes that and says we have to work with our like-minded allies who share our values, a commitment to transparency, high labor standards, to, you know, friendshore. It can't be in America because of labor prices and the like, but it ought to be in our allied shores. So, for example, the Indo-Pacific, this is a huge, I think, part of why we launched this. You know, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines are in this Indo-Pacific economic framework. If they sign up for the framework and the standards of transparency, labor, environment, sharing data with the U.S., you can imagine they have a lot to gain, right? Especially companies are leaving China.
Sure.
You saw the other day Apple said they're considering getting out of China. They're going to look to Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, et cetera. And I think that's why we want this economic framework. It's also good for America, right? Like, I would like to believe, and I believe it to be true, that this Indo-Pacific economic framework, if we do our job right, the next time a COVID-like supply chain disruption comes about, we'll get through it more smoothly than we did this time. You know, Malaysia right now has a lot of semiconductor packaging facilities. When they went down because of COVID outbreaks, it meant 10,000 people in an auto manufacturing operation in Michigan lost their jobs, or were furloughed. If we had had, you know, greater transparency, data flow, monitoring as between Malaysia and the U.S., our supply chain in the U.S. would have been less disrupted. So that's that's kind of what we're talking about
So
here.
these are really big, I mean, worthy goals, but really big shifts. I mean, supply chains have been built up over decades, and there are calls right now in certain quarters of the U.S. and elsewhere for the administration to say drop tariffs on China in order to fight inflation short term. Is that a possibility?
We're looking at it. You know, we are looking at it. The president is, I just spent 6 days with him, and he's so focused on inflation, you know, constantly asking me, all of his advisors, what more can we do? What more can we do? Tariffs is obviously a tool in the toolbox that any president has to bring down costs. So it's something that we're analyzing.
Yeah. What about, talk a little bit about the situation with sanctions, export controls in regards to Russia, war in Ukraine. Where are you with Europe on that? What else can be done? And in a larger sense, what's the conversation between the U.S. and Europe about what this new world of trade and sort of blocks, let's say, you know, liberal democracies versus state-run economies are going to look like? You know, are they on page? Are the U.S. and Europe on page with this? Right
on page. You know, more than on page. Our partners in the European Union were amazing. You know, I manage the export controls, the Commerce Department does, and, you know, in December and January when we were having our meetings to prepare for this, we reached out to our European partners and we just immediately aligned. And then together we were able to lead the rest of the world to come on board. This is unprecedented. I mean, we led a coalition of 37 countries in a period of weeks to come on board, to together align our export controls. I mean, Taiwan, on their own, at our request, said they would not ship any semiconductors to Russia. So this was really an example of how you build coalitions, not through force, but through leadership and being united around, you know, around a set of values. So I said this last night at dinner, I am one of the reasons for optimism, I believe, is that this renewed closeness as between the U.S. and EU and our Asian, partners provides us with an opportunity to take the momentum that we've developed around Russia and push it forward. And that's the risk, right? We can't lose the moment. It was an urgent moment, so it's on us now to seize that momentum.
Yeah. A lot to deal with in advance of the midterms. It's a very tough moment to message what you're trying to message. In some ways, all the things that you're talking about, a new alliance around trade, more resilient supply chains. We haven't really gotten to sustainability, but of course that's part of what the president wants to do as well. And the CHIPS bill, has elements of that. These things could be very disinflationary in the long term, but potentially inflationary in the short term. People are struggling in the U.S. Housing prices are through the roof.
Yeah.
How are you going to get through the next year, and just kind of manage the domestic crisis, really, that's brewing and all the things that make people middle class, housing, healthcare, education?
Yes, these are real issues. We first of all, we can't, and certainly the president doesn't, minimize these issues. And you talk about housing. We have a crisis of housing supply. This is pretty simple, and I saw this as governor. This is economics 101. We have to increase supply of housing. There is not enough affordable housing. And when I say affordable housing, so many people think, Section 8 housing, high rises. I'm talking about a home for a middle-class family. In Rhode Island, it was, say, a $200,000 home for mom, dad, and a couple of kids. You can't find one.
Yeah. No, it's incredible.
It's incredible, and you live in Brooklyn. I can't even imagine.
Yeah.
So housing is a huge driver of inflation.
Yeah.
And we need to increase supply. With respect to everything else, look, the Fed has the most powerful tools to deal with inflation, and certainly we respect the leadership of the Fed and their independence. They've taken action. They may need to take more action. 8% is untenable, and so
it feels like we're at a bit of a Volcker moment, Jay Powell and the president are kind of on page saying inflation is the most important thing. Yes. Of course, that creates a tricky situation. Retail investors are more in the market than ever before. If there's a correction because of inflation fighting, that's going to have a knock-on effect in the real economy. How are you thinking about that mix right now and how to play it?
I'm glad I'm not Jay Powell. It's a hard job. It's a very hard job that he has to try to land the plane on inflation, which is necessary, without putting the brakes on the economy. I would say this. I'm a lot more worried about inflation than a recession. The economy is strong, fundamentally. The past year, we've seen, skyrocketing growth, 6% GDP, wages are up, hiring is up, the labor market is strong, U.S. businesses are investing, you're seeing capital investments like you haven't seen in a long time, manufacturing is coming back. So the fundamentals of our economy are very strong. Inflation is the problem, and so I think that's why we have to really get it under control.
We have maybe 3 or 4 more minutes left. Let me pull together some of the threads. We've been hearing a lot in the last few days about the post-pandemic challenges and opportunities, remote work, potential outsourcing of all kinds of service jobs now. Suddenly if you can do something not in New York but in Tahoe, well, why can't you do it in India too? There's a whole new world potentially of white-collar outsourcing globally. There's also interesting opportunities for women to be doing more hybrid work, which in some ways might be good, bringing them into the workplace. Other people are saying, no, this is going to create a very bifurcated workplace in which there's going to be insiders and outsiders. You've also got this changing geography of work. Certain cities are booming, certain cities are being hollowed out. That's going to have issues with tax bases and school funding. And it really does feel like we're almost at a generational pivot point with the geography of work. Connect some of the dots there, and particularly how it connects to the administration's priorities around the care economy, education, childcare, getting and keeping more women in the workplace.
Yeah, so let me say this. We have to do place-based economic development. You know, I was on a panel last night with Tom Donilon, former National Security Advisor. He said, and I agree with him, America's greatest national security risk is our domestic political situation and the fact that we, you know, haven't invested in America. So if we allow certain regions or communities to be, you know, permanently hollowed out, that is a huge problem. And we've seen it. We've seen it. You know, the Rust Belt and coal communities. Folks aren't moving. They're going to live there. It's their home. And they need and deserve jobs to do in their home. So we have to be aware of that. As it relates to women, this is something that I am actually very, very concerned about, and I don't think it's enough attention. Women have not done well during COVID, and our economy won't thrive if we don't do a better job of figuring out how to fully unleash the talent that women have. And we're not doing a good job. 57% of college degrees go to women.
57%
of college in the United States go to women. Millions of women dropped out of the workforce in COVID and aren't back. Or they're back, you know, part-time at a lower level job relative to their skill. And, you know, when I was in Seoul, and I just use this as an example, I hear it all the time, I did a convening of a dozen CEOs of the biggest Korean companies, tech companies, and American companies. And they're all investing. You know, Samsung's just made a $17 billion investment in Texas, all of them, LG, et cetera. They tell me their biggest worry is, how are we going to find the workers?
Skills,
How are we going to find the workers? I'm going to tell you right now, you're not going to find the workers if you don't do a much better job finding women, attracting women, and retaining women. I hear so often from male business leaders who say, you know, we're trying to find women, they just can't stay. Well, change the way you do business. Everything about the way business is run, in many cases, is based on the default of male and a traditional gender roles. So it's time, and I'm not talking about lowering standards, I'm talking about being innovative. Because if you don't, we're not going to win. Like, I'm obsessed. My job at the Commerce Department is helping to America to compete economically on the global stage. I want every American business, from the smallest to the biggest, to compete on the global stage and win. We will not do that if we lose the talent war, and we will not win the talent war unless we totally tap into the potential of women. So this is something, I mean, you asked about the care economy, I know we're out of time, but, you know, women can't work without childcare, without universal pre-K. These are no-brainers.
Well, and also, I mean, this kind of comes back full circle to where we started, which is the need for investment. If business is going to grow, business also has to invest in a tax base that creates services and supports human capital, which is where all the value is, and we all know that.
That's why you are so good at your job that you just brought that full circle. Boom. Love that.
And place-based economics. Place matters. The world is not flat. How about that for a pithy ending to this?
You're good.
Secretary, such a pleasure to be with you. Thank you. We could go on and on, but really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Rana. Thank you.